Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College here at Middle Tennessee State University. And for those of you watching online, welcome. And certainly for all of you who are here with us today, our students and our panel participants, we're delighted to have you here. Before I launch into anything, I want to say special thank you to Susan Lyons for organizing all of this, making this work technologically, and a big thank you to Dr. Mary Evans, who is co-facilitating this series with me and who's responsible for bringing on board so many really outstanding speakers for the series. I also want to express gratitude on behalf of the Honors College to the MT Engage program, with whom we are partnering today for this program. Students in this class, I would encourage you to learn more about the MT Engage program on our campus. There are some really good scholarship opportunities available for you, and the work that you do in this class, among other classes listed as MT Engage classes, can be part of the e-portfolio that you eventually produce. It's a fantastic program as part of MTSU's academic master plan and our commitment to student success. So I encourage you to learn more about it. So today's program is titled Civic Virtue and Participatory Democracy, Transforming Ourselves, Transforming Our Community. And this is a community conversation led by two professors in our MTSU Department of History. Dr. Adonijah Bakari is Associate Professor in the MTSU Department of History and Director of the College of Liberal Arts' Africana Studies program. His undergraduate degree is from Tuskegee University. His MA is from Northeastern Illinois University, and his PhD from Temple University. Dr. Bakari's research centers on spirituality, manhood development, and learning through travel abroad, especially to sub-Saharan Africa, where he takes MTSU students for overseas travel, study, research, and experiential learning. For both research and community service, Dr. Bakari is part of the Rutherford County Manhood Redemption Project for the Rutherford County Drug Court. He brings his deep knowledge of redemption and restorative justice to our discussion today. Dr. Jennifer.Pettit, lecturer in the MTSU Department of History, received her undergraduate degree from Transylvania University, her master's degrees from the University of Kentucky, and her PhD in U.S. history from Rutgers University in New Jersey, where her research examined the domestic aesthetics of liberal capitalism in the early 20th century. She particularly focused on the household and organizational labor of middle-class white and Black women who asserted their political equality by making homes into attractive, comfortable symbols of political entitlement and economic achievement. The feminist and critical race theories that informed Dr. Pettit's research also influenced her interest in democratic and critical pedagogies, about which she will be leading our discussion today. So Dr. Pettit, I'm pleased to be able to pass the mic over to you, as it were, and to Dr. Bakari to moderate and guide our conversation this afternoon, and for you to be able to introduce our other participants.
Thank you, Dean Phillips, for that introduction. My name is Jennifer.Pettit, and I'll be working behind the scenes today to facilitate this discussion. I want to read our gratitude to the Honors College for sponsoring this opportunity to reflect on the purpose and practice of participatory democracy. The idea for this panel originated in a conversation with Dr. Mary Evans, and during that conversation, we really shared our mutual anguish about the events that are fracturing our society today. And we resolved to convene a panel of academics, educators, and activists to reflect on the motives, perspectives, goals, and skills that we must cultivate to heal and strengthen our communities through democratic critique and engagement. I have the pleasure of introducing a remarkable group of panelists today, and these brief introductions fail to capture the full extent of their accomplishments and their contributions both to the university and to their respective communities. Dr. Tyson King-Meadows is a professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He holds affiliate faculty appointments in the School of Public Policy, the Department of Africana Studies, and the Language, Literacy, and Cultural Doctoral Program. His research examines Black political behavior, legislative politics, public opinion, and voting rights. He is the author of several academic journal articles and monographs, as well as the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. In January, Dr. King-Meadows will become UMBC's first Associate Provost for Strategic Initiatives. Dr. Michelle Stevens brings a wealth of academic, professional, and clinical experience to this discussion. She is a member of MTSU's clinical mental health faculty. Through offering courses in counseling, lifespan development, and multicultural counseling, Dr. Students shares with her students research in service learning advocacy projects, cultural competency, and improving the experiences and increasing the retention of minorities at primarily white institutions. An MTSU graduate, Dr. Shane McCoy, has returned to MTSU as lecturer in the Department of English at Middle Tennessee State University and teaches undergraduate courses that focus on first-year composition, African American literature, and gay and lesbian literature. Dr. McCoy completed their PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle, where their research focused on curriculum affect and critical and feminist pedagogies within the context of instructional scaffolding as it intersects with social justice and pedagogies of empowerment. Dr. McCoy's work appears in several scholarly journals. After receiving her MSW from MTSU, Ms. Jackie Jones worked as a consultant for the Housing, Health, and Human Services Alliance of Rutherford County. She experienced firsthand the importance of capacity building through a trifold process of needs assessment, grant writing, and community input. Her work at HARC helps to illuminate both the challenges and possibilities of systems theory and collective impact to foster collaboration among diverse stakeholders. Dr. Bakari is our panel's co-organizer and our moderator for today. I'm going to turn the microphone over to him, and he will be posing questions to our panelists to initiate a dialogue on the meaning of civic virtue, democracy, and the relationship of these concepts to each other. We will be reserving time at the end of this conversation for questions from our audience. To submit a question to our panelists, please use the chat function. I'll be curating these questions for Dr. Bakari. Thank you.
Hey, hello. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Make sure my mic is on. It's good to have you all here. This is a strange new world that we're diving into. But you know, we're making do and kind of learning as we go. I guess that's part of human nature. You know, we just keep chugging away. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank Mary and Jennifer for, you know, pulling this together. Also, quick story, when Jennifer called me about 5 months ago about this panel, I said, oh, no. I have too much grass to cut. Too much grass to cut. Then Mary is pretty tough. Mary called me back and twisted my arm on this. And I have to say that it's really, really gone well. I'm really happy to be part of it. And I know some of the panelists, Michelle and Tyson, I kind of, you know, talked Tyson into it, and I think he'll really enjoy it. Dr. Phillips, thank you for hosting also. So I'd like to start off by raising these questions, and panelists, you all don't have to answer them exactly as I answer. I've already told Jennifer that we're going to try to hold Dr. King-Meadows to 5 minutes for his answer, which I know will be very difficult for him. So we'll ask the panelists just to kind of hold their answers to about 5 to 8 minutes, and we will have time at the end for you to add more to your answer if need be, and also for students to ask questions. Dr. King-Meadows, historians typically associate the concept of civic virtue with white, male revolutionary leaders and authors of the Constitution. Could you help the students in attendance today understand what the concept of civic virtue means to you first, and then what it meant to our founders and why they place so much emphasis on its importance?
Well, good afternoon. It's great to see everyone. And yes, I will try to hold my response to 5 to 7 minutes. So civic virtue is a way of understanding the political, social, economic environment around you and what's affecting you, how politics or politicians and public policy affect you. So the way I understand civic virtue is situating yourself in an information environment to help you understand your own interests. What are you interested in? And then connecting the dots between your interests and what politicians or public policy is happening in your environment, your local, your state, your national. And then thinking beyond yourself, thinking beyond your immediate interests, and then thinking how those interests intersect with others. That's my definition of civic virtue. From an intersectionality perspective, civic virtue forces you to do a 360 about a public policy and say, how does it affect individuals who don't look like me, who are not part of my socioeconomic strata or my race or gender identity or my religious identity, and how would that affect them? And then coming up with a decision point about what you're going to do about that policy. So shortly stated, I think the founders get a bad rap for a lot of things that they did. I think people don't sort of take it apart. So let's put slavery and sexism aside for a second and just look at the Federalist Papers, specifically number 51, where James Madison says, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. Right? So if men governed men, then that means you've got to establish a government to, one, control itself, and to control the governed, or to govern. And that's very difficult, particularly when individuals have interests that are self-centered. And I'm not saying self-centered is bad in this regard. Self-centered is good if you are so self-centered that you are aware of your public policy perspectives and your preferences, and then govern yourself accordingly in a way that may or may not interfere with the rights of others. So the question about why they put so much importance on civic virtue is you got to understand how they set the government up, right? Before the Senate was popularly elected, state legislators selected an individual to go to Washington, D.C. to represent the entire state, okay? That's because they didn't trust the democratic impulses of individuals, okay? And I think if this panel is about what is going on now, what we see is that there really is an echo chamber where individuals are not paying attention to other things. They're in socioeconomic strata or in social networks where they're already getting fed what they already think. So it just strengthens their positions instead of engaging in other things. And the founding fathers understood that that was possible. So you need to insulate government from the democratic impulses, because the democratic impulses can be wrong. And so if the democratic impulses can be wrong, you need a structure to do something about that. So the Senate's not popularly elected at this time, okay? House of Representatives is. The president is not popularly elected, meaning not elected by the popular vote. You have the Electoral College. The Senate confirms individuals who would sit on the highest court, which we know as the Supreme Court. There's no popular election to the Supreme Court. And so whether we like that model or not, I'm going to set that aside. The idea behind that model is to allow the governed to govern, but also to control itself, because the people will select their state legislators, which will select the senator. The people will vote for their House of Representatives member. Those two chambers will work together to pass public policies. The popular vote will impact the electoral college vote. The electoral college will select the president. The president will work with the Senate to confirm justices to the Supreme Court. Okay? Now, fast forward. Let's call this 1960s, right? If you put desegregation on the ballot, most Southerners at that point who were able to articulate their preferences probably would not want desegregation. So you need a strong president, let's call that President Eisenhower. You need a popular civil rights movement agitation, and you need a narrative that says that there are some laws that are unjust because they don't treat people equally under the 14th Amendment, which was one of the Civil War amendments. So yes, the democratic impulses can be wrong and they can hurt people. So you have to think about democratic impulses and democratic civic virtue broader than just, if I want it, I'm going to get it. Because people might want something totally opposite, like your oppression.
Oh. All right. Thank you. And we're gonna, let me ask just one quick question of you, because you stayed under your 8 minutes. Look at that. Dr. King-Meadows, do you see civic virtue eroding today, or is it becoming more important? Is it less important today, or is it more important today in your opinion?
It's absolutely more important today. For citizens who can vote and individuals who can engage in the public's policy arena, whether they're citizens or not, to really pay attention to what's going on, what the government is doing, and have an orientation towards more information that's different than your perspective. Okay? Now, I know it's hard to get various perspectives, okay? You go on Twitter, you go on Facebook, and you get the news as you know it. You turn on the television, you get the news as you know it. You listen to the radio, the news as you know it. You talk to people, the news as you know it. But literally, you might be talking to people who have the same preferences. You might be listening to the radio station or the social media that have the same preferences as you do. And so you're really not, you're informed, but that's with an asterisk, right? So think of all your favorite sports personalities and all the sports history that you know about, and think about the asterisk that is next to some person's name. You look at that and you say, wait a minute, did he really hit 300 home runs? Well, maybe he was on steroids. Or did that individual really run that 100-yard sprint? Maybe he was on steroids. Did that university team really win the NCAA championship? They violated the NCAA rules. Let's take the banner down, right? Imagine your information in your head having an asterisk every time you only listen to what your favorite news source is. That's not civic virtue. Civic virtue is being informed, but it's also being engaged in a way that you can understand the opposing argument. Whether you agree with it or not doesn't mean that you shouldn't understand it. And then come to a conclusion based on the facts. Not facts light, not diet facts, but the actual facts, okay? So right then, there means there's a contestation over the facts. Right? You should be informed enough to say, here is what science says. Here is what one side of science says. This is how another scientist say, and I'm going to come up with my conclusion. But it's much more important now than ever because we're living in an echo chamber. We're literally living in an echo chamber where individuals only watch one news. We have data on this, folks. I'm an empirical social scientist. We have data. So it's not like pulling it out of here. People only watch one news channel, only read one newspaper. If they read, they only listen to one sort of Twitter feed or one sort of Facebook, or they have individuals in their social network. We do, social network analysis. say Franklin in political science, does social network analysis, you can tell how people are in a sort of cluster. So it's much more important now to go outside, step outside your sort of comfort zone and start thinking about what your actual vote might translate into, or that sign in your yard, or who you're talking about. We call them peer effects, discussion effects. It does matter when you talk to your elders at Thanksgiving or on the weekend, July 4th, and they're around the table and they say, oh, this is the facts. And you go, well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. All right. People can change, people can move, but if people are only talking to themselves, it's not going to work. And going back to the founding fathers, sort of remember, they understood it took a long time for news to travel. So something happens in Virginia doesn't mean Rhode Island's going to know just like that. Okay. But now if something happens in Virginia, not only does Rhode Island know just like that, but the individual sitting in Accra in Ghana, they know exactly just like that, because we are now connected more than we ever were. So that also means we're also more persuadable because we are connected. And we're connected and people tell us things and then we tend to believe them without checking.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you. Thank you. And students, we're going to allow you all time to ask some questions. So if you have something you want to get more clarity on, make sure you write it down so you don't forget. Dr. Stevens, how are you doing?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
All right, I'm doing well. So from your perspective, how would you define civic virtue?
So from my perspective, so I'm a counselor educator and I'm also a clinical mental health counselor. So I have a private practice, and so I am a counselor and I teach people to become counselors, school counselors and mental health counselors as well. And so that question, I have a twofold answer. So in terms of counselor, just the counseling field, when we think of this, we can think of it in terms of the therapeutic alliance, right? And how it can be framed in positive psychology, meaning very empowering. So engaging a client to kind of assess where they are in terms of where they want to be. Are they self-actualized, and are they doing the work that they feel like they should do? And as they're doing that, using positive psychology in the way of helping them to empower themselves and giving them that empowerment, and talking about wisdom and humanity, justice, and temperance, and really engaging the client in that, right? From a clinical standpoint now, it is in the climate that we are in, I have a variety of clients who come and see me, right? My primary work is trauma. And so historical trauma as well, right? So I do a lot of work with people of color, particularly those who identify as Black. They come in. And so this has been a very interesting time doing therapy with those individuals. And so helping them to kind of relate what is happening, how they're feeling, and how their environment, this environment, the climate that we're in, is impacting them on a mental health level. And it has not been a fun time. And so not only helping them to understand, but also helping them to heal, right? As it pertains to what's happening. On the counselor education track, as clinical mental health counselors and school counselors, our accreditation board and ACA, American Counseling Association, they have a code of ethics where we are supposed to, in our role as counselors, to be advocates. And to be advocates in order to stand in the gap for those who either their voice is unheard, it's been silenced, and ignored, those things. And so part of our advocacy is being culturally competent and aware of our own biases, and to be able to advocate for individuals and groups who need it, whether that's in the schools, whether that's in a clinical mental health setting, whether that's institutionally, all of those things. We are bound to do that by our code of ethics, to be an advocate. And so when I think of the civic virtue, that's what it is also, right? It's advocating for those who are not like us and those who are.
Let me ask you the same question I asked Dr. King-Meadows. Do you see civic virtue being more important because of the present political and social climate that we're in, or maybe less important?
Absolutely more. I totally agree. And I see that on a lot of different levels. When it comes to the advocacy, I think there's a part, like I said, with the clients that I tend to see, and students in the field, it's hard to advocate for someone when you are hurting yourself, right? And so I think that the healing needs to happen on an individual level, but also a community level. And so having conversations like this and leading groups, I know as an institution, I know that we are having conversations that are being led by professional counselors, where we are talking about what it feels like right now for those who don't feel like they have a voice, and or their voice was ignored for a long time, what in the psychological world you hear as gaslighting. And so we know that certain groups, and particularly the African American community, has been gaslighted for hundreds of years, because we have been screaming and crying and pleading when it comes to how we've been treated, and not necessarily heard, and been told that we're crazy, right? So just that in itself, I think the gaslighting and the historical trauma that, you don't know necessarily that it's trauma until you see the symptoms, right? If you understand post-traumatic stress disorder, I think we're seeing that being played out, right? And so I think it's most certainly important, very important in the climate that we're in right now.
So how would civic virtue as a larger societal piece help with institutional trauma or trauma faced by African Americans and people of color today? How would it help?
I think it's happening right now. I think the beginning steps of that is happening, and what that looks like is a mass, a larger part of the society, right? So when we know that the greater majority had to pause during COVID and didn't necessarily have a lot of the distractions that have been there before, when we talk about sports and we talk about things like that, we all had to sit and watch really painful things. And I think that what happened is that we're being believed slowly and surely. And I think that is validating. And so how, to answer your question, the validation that comes with being heard and understood, I think that's how, and I think that it's starting to happen.
All right, thank you. Dr. McCoy, good afternoon.
There we go. Hi.
Hey, all right. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
All right. Related to the cultivation of civic virtue, public education has historically served to unify diverse citizenry and reproduce the national ideology by imparting a common bond of knowledge and principles. This historical function has been rightly critiqued as anti-democratic, but with the current fixation on accountability, our public schools have become even more standardized in their curriculum and instruction with significant cost to civic education. Can you give us your definition of civic virtue? And then how do you think education today, say public school education, or even maybe education at the university, is leading this charge in a positive way, or are we kind of dragging our feet?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I just want to say thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me to this panel, because this is like phenomenal. And the fact that we are all so isolated from one another, I think it serves, proof that this is really necessary. And so, Dr. Bakari, I will speak to this idea of civic virtue, and also the place of looking at its function in a public education setting. But I'm going to speak to this from the place of someone who is a millennial and who is 34 and who is very, just to be quite honest with y'all, just incredibly disenchanted with, our current political system. And also just, I'm speaking to you from a Zoom chat box. And so like, I never imagined, because I've been involved with universities for almost 15 years, I never imagined that this would be the platform that we would be sharing something in fall of 2020. And I remember speaking to my therapist early on when the pandemic started. I was like, I'm really curious to see how humanity is going to play out in this. And the longer it goes on, the worse I think we're starting to get. It's like, the complete bifurcation of how we are starting to see this pandemic, and also just seeing how it's been used as a type of weapon, how it's been weaponized as a way to create these various factions. Something as simple as wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, and how has that been weaponized? And so what I think about civic virtue is I do think about what Dr. King-Meadows has mentioned about how one is engaging with various types of media and various types of social media platforms in particular. So I'm going to speak to this from the perspective of, there was two films I saw over the weekend. One was The Social Dilemma, directed by Netflix, about the engagement of social media as a tool for completely sowing political disruption, political chaos, right? And so in The Social Dilemma, the argument that is being made is that, social media is one of the main reasons that, we have become such a polarized nation. But I tend to view social media as simply symptomatic of that polarization that was already there. And so social media is simply, taking credit for a lot of things that have been, in the social fabric of the United States for centuries. And I think, social media is just having its way with it. But then a second film that I watched this past weekend was Antebellum, the new film with Janelle Monáe, which is fantastic. And it's a really interesting way of looking at, of Civil War reenactments from this place of complete romanticized belief from the part of Southern whites, right? And to speak to what Michelle Stevens was talking about with trauma, right? A Civil War reenactment is a type of trauma. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind, that this is the traumas that many people are living. It's not just, your great grandfather, had a plantation or something, and you're wanting to reach back to that romantic idea that was never there to begin with. And it's just all of these various types of ways of viewing history. And so to speak to the place of public education, I tend to weigh on the side of the fact that, I actually got the questions from Jennifer on Friday, and I tend to waver on these questions. It's like, can public education be a type of way of socializing students? And based on my research, and based off of what I've conducted, I've taught in several parts of the United States. I taught in Seattle for a number of years. Then I moved to the South, and I've taught in the South for a number of years. And what I can tell you is that in the metropole, in the cosmopolitan North, what we would consider to be the North, they think they're above these conversations of racism, homophobia, and sexism, right? And then when we come to the South, there's this idea of, this idea of white guilt, or we're trying to like, guilt the parties that so to be in power. And it's really interesting to work through these various types of tensions, which has me to think that I think public education can be a type of civic education, but we have to think of how knowledge is historically structured. We have to think of who is creating this knowledge. And so if we think of standardized curriculum, if we think of standardization, if we think of the way in which students are socialized, right, vis-a-vis educational systems, I think there's a way that students are socialized to be compliant, to not rock the boat, so to speak, to not, dissent from the popular opinion. And so until that popular opinion is completely dismantled, which I'm all in the favor of doing, completely destructuring it, right? As someone who is queer, as someone who is from a non-binary gender position, like I'm all in favor of like completely dismantling it, because it does a great disservice to those of us who don't have our voices recognized, who don't have a quote unquote seat at the table when we're not even in the room, right? Or even on the campus, so to speak. And so one of the things I like thinking of with my classes, I teach a gay and lesbian literature class, and I also do a queer theory class this semester. I joke with my students, and they're predominantly queer students, I joke with them that it's just a group therapy session. Because it becomes group therapy. When you're in a class full of people who identify as similarly with you, and come to that material, I teach literature primarily, so they're coming to that literature with all of these various life experiences, that is a different type of effect being produced than students from, a white upper middle class background that might not have necessarily those life experiences that we would see in various types of marginalized communities. So, to go back to what Dr. King-Meadows was talking about, I think we need a critical media literacy to be able to do that type of work. We need to think about how technology is being utilized. To go back to the social dilemma, there's a term that they use in the social dilemma, and they call it persuasive technology. So persuasive technology is the type of technologies that we're given, like our cell phones, social media. And, there's all these algorithms that produce what you see on your news feed, whether it be Facebook or Twitter, right? And so if your algorithm is being produced by stuff that you're interested in, then the chances of you being exposed to something completely different is very limited, right? Even thinking about the ads that you see on Facebook or Twitter, or, just what your friends are posting, if it's very much in line with what you are interested in, then it's simply going to reflect what you already think and believe. I mean, it's the confirmation bias. But there's also, as much as I want to speak to critical media literacy as being a tool, and to go back into thinking about how public education can help this, is to think of the ways in which this could also easily backfire. And so, when we see various types of social movements in the United States, to speak to the pandemic, earlier in the pandemic, we were like, oh, let's see how this pans out for humanity. And as it continues to go on, it's like a complete disruption. And so I think what we're seeing now is like this backfire effect. That many of us are experiencing, whether it be, rejections about masks, or, the political, the atmosphere that is currently being had. We're voting for president in 6 weeks, yay. And so it's just all these things that they're happening at the right moment or at the same time. And I think it's really interesting how, the pandemic started, and then it was like we were all primed for grief. And then the Black Lives Matter movement resurfaced in May. And part of me as a scholar, but also as someone who is an educator, my question goes, why did it take this to wake people up, right? Why did it take hundreds of thousands of people dying? Why did it take, George Floyd's death in Minneapolis on Memorial Day weekend for people to wake up. And I think as an educator, I just get really disenchanted. I try not to be such a cynic at such a young age, but it's really hard not to go to that place of cynicism. And so now I'm trying to frame, a pedagogy of virtue as also being critically hopeful at the same time, but also skeptical of what type of education would be helpful for cultivating this type of pedagogy of virtue. And I think as long as we maintain these particular types of disjunctures, I think if we not necessarily capitalize on them, but if we see them as not simply as something new, as something novel, but as something that has been incredibly ingrained in the fabric of US democracy, right? If we think of Ta-Nehisi Coates's, the arc of history bends toward chaos, I think that's something we need to think about in terms of curriculum and structure. We have to teach the conflicts, right? We have to teach that, history is not neat and tidy, that, knowledge production is not neat and tidy. But the way that we teach this stuff and the way that we socialize students is to see knowledge as neat and tidy, to see history as neat and tidy, and that's just not the case. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
you did. And we'll have a few minutes to come back to you, depending on how many questions students have. So hold that thought. Excellent. Very good, very good. All right. Mrs. Jones, good afternoon.
Hi.
Hey, through your work in the field of asset-based community development, can you share with the students what role you think civic virtue has for social activism, community activism? Where do you see this, the power in civil virtue?
I think it is just such an absolutely essential piece of both. I think normally the work I did specifically was people who were experiencing homelessness. So I think looking back, let's say 6 months ago, community-based asset management would have been any of these larger social community issues: poverty, lack of access to health care. And I think the timing, along with the way this intersects with what everyone else has said, it's really such a beautiful opportunity for those very best things that we want from our young people and as we continue to get older. But really looking at these ideas of volunteerism, really setting aside the individual for the public good, definitely doing that in times when other people are different than you. I think an interesting piece of this, and those of you that are in the Murfreesboro community or in the South in general, there's this layer of a moral or a religious piece that kind of aligns alongside of this. And for some people, those are two separate paths. There's a civic virtue that is just, I want to be part of making my community better. I want to be part of something bigger than I am. In Murfreesboro, we also have alongside of that, and sometimes not separated, this is what I want to do spiritually, or because this is what I believe is my religious purpose. So it's been interesting to see how those two things can kind of go alongside of each other. What happened in Murfreesboro is we had the opposite of an asset-based community development isn't like a traditional need-based. So you look at somebody, usually from the outside, comes in and says there's something wrong with this community, or I'm identifying that this community has an issue with graduation, or this community has an issue with crime or safety. And so it's a very top-down approach to community development. Asset-based community development is very much about building on these this idea that everyone has strengths, that everyone has gifts in our community, and that everybody has something to contribute. And it is through the relationships that we are able to build community that then becomes truly sustainable for change, versus this older model, which is what we would have called transactional. Like, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to be able to measure this because I've served 52 meals. And you end up with this sort of parallel. There's not a true building of that connection or that true building of community, which is what, when we talk about everything going on right now, the piece that I think gives us a tiny bit of hope is that we're seeing opportunities, hopefully, for especially, I mean, we can hope that people like myself, that I am going to be able to enter in and listen, to be present, and to truly hear what individuals and communities, that I can hear what their needs are instead of me telling them what their needs should be. And so that's where I'm really hopeful. And that's what we know about when communities really are able to change. It's when they're able to bring the best of each person. So like we were talking about the individual at the counseling level, we have to do our own stuff. We have to do our own work. Like, we have to be able, when we go into these communities, to be able to know what our strengths are and what our gifts are, and to be able to share those in a way that we really can come together in a way that can really make a difference. From everything from, what we call these, issues, huge issues, poverty, lack of education, opportunities for people. A huge issue, of course, everybody is aware of, lack of affordable housing, lack of ability to have a working wage so that you can afford even what housing there is. And that's what, from a social work perspective, this idea of systems, that each piece of this is, you can't just address one part of it. It has to be the whole. So that, I think, and especially with our young people, they want to know what they can do. And so I think some of these skills, becoming just being able to be a profoundly different listener than what we're really taught to be. Being able to really have this more strengths-based, like, how do I see something positive in this person who maybe just said or did something that like totally triggered me, because I feel like we must be on opposite sides of the planet. So it's a different way of building that relationship, so that hopefully we can work on some of this divisiveness in a way that's truly productive in our communities.
I like that idea of listening as a civic virtue. We don't usually think about that. I want to open this up to students because it's 3:54, and I want to give them a few minutes to jump in with any questions, and maybe some of our other Jennifer or Mary or anybody else who has questions or comments. Hey, Victoria. Hey. Is that Victoria, our secretary in the history department? Oh, maybe not. Wrong Victoria. So let me open that up to students. You've heard quite a bit. Do you have any questions? And limited to one question, not 3 or 4 questions inside one. So one question per student, so we have some time for everybody. Questions?
Dr. Bakari, I don't know if you see this wonderful question in the chat, and I think we can also relate it to a couple of other questions that have come in, but it's about bridging differences. Okay. And I think that might be this really important, like, this might be this very important topic that we need to take on in our last couple of minutes together. And it's because it's related to everything about the different types of knowledges that people bring into their conversations, the different types of interests that they bring into their conversations, the different ways that they understand the importance of what a common good even is. Like, how do we even begin to define something so comprehensive as a common good from our individual perspectives? And one of the things is that often people will say, oh, it's your university education that is biasing you about how you are understanding these events. And so it's kind of this educational elitism. And so, you know, would you say that higher education is also functioning to produce an echo chamber? And I want to do a slight shift and also incorporate something that Dr. King-Meadows said about good narratives. And so in other words, like, how can in all of these locations that we've talked about, how can we produce a narrative that is both comprehensive and inclusive, yet at the same time it's a good narrative that is helping to support the work of racial and social justice? Sorry, it took me a couple of minutes to get to that, but I was like combining a lot of stuff. And that, how do we balance this sense of that this common good must be defined very inclusively? We have to talk to each other in order to achieve it. But at the same time, are there good narratives, such as in the civil rights movement that Dr. King-Meadows suggested, that can help us create these conversations?
Panelists?
Well, I for one think that there are ways you can do that. I think all the panelists today have talked about different things, the importance of the narrative, because some people are going to be traumatized, or some people are going to bring the trauma into it. And the reality is that we do need to listen to one another and listen to the perspectives that they bring. I think higher education can bias individuals if they believe that what they're learning is the definitive treatment of a subject. That's the only thing, and that is the thing, as opposed to a thing. A thing means that there are multiple ways that you can look at a thing. And going back to thing one and thing two, going back to Dr. Seuss. The idea, though, is that everyone will bring something to the table, and then collectively you can come up with some notion of what's common. And I think what individuals who have higher levels of education should do is step back and say, I am privileged. And because I am privileged, that means I look at things a certain way. But that doesn't mean that is the way of reality for every person. And think about what you might be doing to re-traumatize that individual when you say this is the reality, as opposed to sort of the matrix. There is a common reality that is shared, but your reality may be very different.
Absolutely. And I wanted to add into, in addition to just listening, empathic listening is really important, right? So listening to another person's story, but also, or another group's reality, right? What your reality is, listening to that and understanding it and putting yourselves in that position, right? So I think there's a difference between listening and empathic listening.
All right. And I'm looking at some of the questions that students have sent in.
Do we have time for one more question?
I think we can stretch it and get one more question in. Go ahead there.
I think that this one here about and this again builds on something that all of our panelists have talked about, but this specifically Dr. King-Meadows, and it's this idea that our founding fathers set up the government to insulate it from individual corruption and tyranny, and that was the initial purpose of civic virtue. But then we have this contentious moment where just a beloved Supreme Court justice has recently died, and that the position needs to be reappointed. And you see this real tension that any type of appointment in this particular context is going to be, many people believe that's anti-democratic. But at the same time, I think that the argument is in favor of appointing someone immediately. It's because the two branches of government, the legislative branch and the executive branch, are controlled by the same party, and so therefore appointing a justice that's reflective of the views and political commitments of that party would be very democratic. And so it's just like, how do you balance that argument about what would be the most democratic thing to do at this particular time when we see this tension between the way that our government functions, the way it's set up to function, and what civic virtue, the role of civic virtue in that functioning.
Depends on what side of the coin you're on. But the Senate has a rule that they created called the filibuster, where the minority party can ensure that the majority party listens to them. And so they could implement a filibuster. They could also implement a filibuster crushing rule and go to just simple majority rule. And that's sort of technical stuff. I don't want to get into the weeds, but the idea is the Senate was supposedly the saucer that cooled the tea. What that meant was the Senate is supposed to be the deliberative body of Congress, to take its time, to investigate, to talk, and to really deliberate about what's best for the entire nation. I think the moment we're seeing, and I go back to what Dr. McCoy said, I think what we're actually seeing is democracy at work. And I think people are getting upset because now they can actually see democracy at work. Instead of being wherever they're going without the pandemic, you're actually seeing democracy work. So what that means is your vote or your decision to sit on your couch ripples through the entire political process. So yes, if you don't vote in the midterm elections, that means that certain senators are going to get elected. Yes, if you don't vote in your presidential election, that means if a Supreme Court justice retires or dies, that person is going to be able to have that nomination. And so I know people are sort of upset about it, but the reality of the situation is this. Your vote empowers an entire group of individuals you see and don't see to make public policy. So when you stay home, that also empowers another group to make public policy. So some Republicans are going to say it's anti-democratic for Trump not to get this nominee through and Mitch McConnell should do what he does. Some Democrats are going to say, oh, but the election is not until, the election is right here. Okay, I understand that. And there are some precedent about waiting. I understand that. But the reality of this is that Trump is the president until the next inauguration of another president. And so if people are upset about it, that's okay. But step back and say, this is the structure that was set up. And if you know the rules, then just like Monopoly, you know when you land on Go, you know when you land on Boardwalk. So you know when you stay home, 4 years later, you might be revisiting your decision. That's why I want to participate in these things, because it might not be today, but 4 years from now, you might say, wait a minute, what's going on? Or the midterm, I don't know what's going on. Your vote translates into who's in the governor's position. And you're in Tennessee. I used to be at MTSU. I know MTSU well. Okay. So think of your governor, think of your state legislature that draws the congressional districts, that choose the congressional representatives to go in and pass the budget. Your choice of a vote is the most important weapon you have against all kinds of tyranny and corruption, seen and unseen. So I don't care who you vote for. I do not. I care that you vote. And going back to civic virtue, that's what the founding fathers were talking about. The ability to understand your interests and how your interests intersect with the economy. And going back to Dr. McCoy's point, remember the Constitution came to be because of Shays' Rebellion. We already had the Articles of Confederation that didn't work. It didn't work because you couldn't convince anybody to join in to suppress a rebellion. But the Constitution, yes, they met in secret twice, yes, yes, yes. But the Constitution came out of the same moment that we're in right now, where individuals look at the structure and say it's not working. They look at oppression and say it's not helping us. They're looking at their governments and saying we can do better, we can do better, we can do better. That's what Black Lives Matter is all about. We can do better, we can do better, we can do better. That's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, we can do better.
Hey.
Audre Lorde said it, we can do better.
Right on, right on. Oh, folks, I have enjoyed this. It's been, I've been cooped up for so long. It's good to hear, dialogue and discussion. Jennifer, Mary, Jackie, Michelle, Dr. McCoy, any of you all last points?
I just have one thing to talk about, what has been circled around. And
Doc, you got to keep this short because we're actually over our time.
Well, no, I'm thinking of, I want the students to think about their individual power and also their collective power. That is one thing I want you to consider.
All right,
So.
excellent, excellent. Jennifer, do you want to close us out?
I do. I just want to reiterate what first I want to thank everybody. This has been a fabulous conversation, and I think it's just been so illuminating and really helped us to understand civic virtue from such a comprehensive perspective. But then I also just want to reiterate what's been implied and what everyone has said, and then just to follow up on what Dr. McCoy just said about the importance of exercising power. And you can exercise that power in the classroom, but you cannot exercise the power in the classroom unless you're communicating. It's important to communicate with your professors. It's important to communicate with other students. And in the classroom, you can think about your ability to communicate as a type of vote that you're also exercising, that your franchise also operates in the classroom. And it's really important to exercise it. And that doesn't mean that, and it's kind of like the arc of chaos that you mentioned, because classrooms shouldn't necessarily be neat. It shouldn't necessarily be tidy. It should be a place where we practice democracy and we understand truly what it is, so that we can come to these larger understandings of a collective sense of civic virtue. So thank you so much, everyone, for bringing us to that.
And students, if you all have more questions, I know that our panelists would be open to hearing from you, and maybe we can get their emails posted so that if they have some questions that did not get answered, they could get some more information from our panelists. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and just keep thinking about civic virtue as a means of empowerment, folks. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.